The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, casting a cold glow across the otherwise empty hospital wing. Jacob leaned against the reception counter, trying to stay awake. It was his fourth night shift that week, and exhaustion was settling into his bones. The other nurse, Maria, had stepped out for her break, leaving him alone to man the desk. The hospital was strangely quiet tonight. It had been weeks since the facility had been at full capacity, but the ward felt emptier than usual. Jacob glanced at the clock on the wall. 3:13 a.m. He still had hours to go, and he could feel his eyelids growing heavy. Just then, the intercom crackled to life. A staticky voice whispered, "Room 12A. Help, please." Jacob straightened up. Room 12A was on the far end of the hallway, near the old part of the hospital they'd shut down a year ago. That section had always creeped him out, with its peeling paint, flickering lights, and abandoned equipment lurking in the shadows. The hospital's record-keeping had always been haphazard, so it wasn't surprising to find a patient in the wrong room now and then. But tonight, there shouldn't have been anyone in 12A. His pulse quickened as he left the reception desk, grabbing a flashlight out of habit. The overhead lights flickered slightly as he walked down the hall, his footsteps echoing. He reached the door to 12A. It was slightly ajar. Taking a deep breath, he nudged it open and aimed his flashlight inside. The room was empty. A chill crept down his spine. He could still feel a presence lingering, as if someone had just left. He turned on the light switch, bathing the room in a sickly yellow glow. There was no bed, no equipment, just empty walls and a lingering smell of antiseptic. "Hello?" he called out, his voice barely a whisper. There was no response. The silence pressed in around him, thick and suffocating. He backed out of the room, closing the door, feeling a strange sense of unease settle over him. He decided to check the other rooms in the wing, just to be sure. As he made his way back down the corridor, he could have sworn he heard faint footsteps echoing his own. Just then, Maria returned from her break, startling him. "You okay?" she asked, noticing his pale face. Jacob shook his head, muttering something about room 12A and the strange call over the intercom. Maria's brow furrowed. "Room 12A?" she repeated, her tone wary. "They closed that part of the hospital ages ago. They haven't used that room in years." "I know," Jacob replied, glancing nervously down the hallway, "but I heard a voice on the intercom. Someone asking for help." Maria's face lost all color. "Jacob, the intercom doesn't reach that wing. There's no connection to those rooms anymore. It's been disconnected since the shutdown." Before he could respond, the intercom crackled again. "Room 12A," the voice repeated, but this time it sounded clearer, almost familiar. He didn't recognize the voice until it said his name. "Jacob. Help." He froze. It was his own voice. A feeling of dread settled in his stomach. Maria looked at him, her eyes wide with horror. "That's not funny," she whispered, backing away. But he wasn't laughing. They both stared at the intercom, waiting. "Help," the voice pleaded again, desperate and weak. "Jacob, please." He felt his feet moving before he could think, running back toward room 12A. He needed to know what was happening, even if it meant facing something he didn't understand. He burst through the door, only to find the room exactly as he'd left it, empty. Breathing heavily, he scanned the room with his flashlight, searching every corner, every shadow. But there was nothing, just an oppressive silence pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. Then something caught his eye in the corner of the room. A faint outline, almost like a reflection, but it was him. Jacob stared, unable to move, as he saw himself standing in the shadows, the same uniform, the same terrified expression. "Help," his own voice whispered as the reflection's hand reached out. It was pale, almost transparent, yet it seemed to pull him, dragging him forward. His heart hammered as he tried to resist, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. The intercom crackled to life one final time, but this time the voice that echoed down the empty hallway was Maria's. "Jacob, where are you? Help, please." He whipped around, but the hallway outside was empty, just stretching darkness and faint flickers of light. When he turned back, the reflection was gone, leaving only his own horrified face staring back at him in the glass. In a blind panic, he stumbled out of the room, sprinting back to the reception area. But when he arrived, the desk was deserted. The clock on the wall now read 3:13 a.m., the exact moment he'd left. His heart pounded as he scanned the empty halls. A cold realization hit him. He had never left room 12A. The sounds, the pleas, the footsteps. They were fragments of a memory that wasn't his. And somewhere down that endless hallway, Maria's voice crackled on the intercom. The shift began like any other, but tonight, Lori couldn't shake a heavy sense of dread. She'd been working security for the hospital for 3 years, and the night shift was usually routine. Quiet hallways, the occasional odd noise. But tonight, something felt off. The corridors were darker than usual, the shadows longer. Her flashlight flickered slightly as she moved, but she blamed the dimness on her own tired mind. It had been a long week, and she was operating on minimal sleep. She checked the 3rd floor, the one they usually kept unoccupied since the building's remodel. The maintenance staff had warned her it was haunted, but she'd laughed it off. Ghost stories, she'd said. Just stories to keep us awake. Lori swept her flashlight down the hall. The air felt thick, like stepping into a forgotten space that hadn't been touched in years. Each step echoed around her as she passed empty rooms with their doors slightly ajar. She was just about to turn around, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from room 312. Help. It was so soft, so pleading, that for a moment she thought she'd imagined it. She checked her radio. Maybe one of the other guards was playing a trick on her, but the line was silent. She leaned closer to the door of 312, straining to listen. Help me. Lori's pulse quickened. She wasn't supposed to enter empty rooms alone, but she couldn't ignore the sound. She carefully pushed open the door, peering inside. Her flashlight cast long shadows across the walls, revealing a typical hospital room with an old bed, metal rails still raised on each side. Nothing was out of the ordinary, until she noticed the bed. It looked freshly made, the sheets tucked and smoothed as if waiting for a patient. But there hadn't been patients on this floor for months. She took a step back, and that's when she noticed the smell. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sharp, metallic tang of blood. Her stomach churned as she lifted her flashlight and noticed dark stains splattered on the floor beneath the bed. They were faint, almost faded, but they formed a chilling pattern, as if someone had tried to crawl across the floor but hadn't made it far. The whisper came again, louder this time. Please, I can't. Lori's heart raced as the voice grew more desperate. Her mind scrambled to make sense of it. There was no patient here. There was no one here. But as she took another step back, she saw a faint shadow flicker in the corner of the room. Her flashlight danced over it, and for a split second, she thought she saw a figure, small, hunched, clutching at the edge of the bed with blood-streaked hands. Her breath caught as she focused on the figure. But just as quickly as she'd seen it, it vanished. The room was empty again, but she could still feel it, lingering just outside her line of sight, something clawing desperately at the air. Suddenly, the door behind her slammed shut. She whirled around, gripping the doorknob, her fingers trembling as she tried to twist it open. It wouldn't budge. She was trapped. Please, let me out. The voice was louder now, filling the room, pressing in on her from all sides. She felt a cold hand brush her shoulder, a sensation that sent ice shooting through her veins. She spun around, swinging her flashlight wildly, but there was nothing there. Who's there? She demanded, but her voice sounded small and hollow in the empty room. A faint laughter echoed through the walls, childlike and eerie, as if a child were playing a sick game of hide-and-seek. The laughter grew louder, mingling with sobs and whispers. She pressed herself against the door, pounding with her fists, screaming for anyone to hear. The laughter stopped, leaving only a suffocating silence. And then, in a barely audible whisper, the voice spoke again, but this time it was right in her ear. They never leave. Lori's skin crawled. Her flashlight began to flicker, casting erratic shadows that twisted and contorted along the walls. The light went out completely, plunging her into darkness. She fumbled with her radio, desperate to reach anyone. Base, anyone. I'm stuck on the 3rd floor. I need help, she whispered, her voice barely a tremble. Only static responded, a low hum that grew louder and louder until it filled her head, almost painful. Through the static, a voice cut through, chillingly calm. We've been waiting for you, Lori. Her stomach twisted. The voice was her own, distorted and echoing, as if it were coming from deep inside the walls. She backed against the door, her eyes scanning the darkness. She could make out faint shapes now, figures that seemed to sway and shift just beyond her reach. Their eyes glowed faintly, watching her with silent intensity. The door behind her suddenly creaked open, and she stumbled backward, landing in the hallway. She scrambled to her feet and ran, her flashlight clutched tightly in her hand. The laughter followed her, echoing down the hallway, taunting her as she fled. When she finally reached the elevator, she hammered the button, glancing over her shoulder. The hallway stretched into darkness, endless and filled with shifting shadows. The elevator doors slid open, and she bolted inside, slamming her fist against the ground floor button. The doors closed, shutting out the hallway, but the faint laughter continued, seeping through the walls as the elevator descended. When she finally reached the lobby, she sprinted outside, gasping for air. The fresh, cold night felt like salvation as she stumbled to her car and sped away, glancing in her rearview mirror every few seconds. Later, she would tell her supervisor about what happened, about the laughter, the whispers, the figures in the dark. But he only stared at her with pity, shaking his head. "You're the third guard this month who said that," he muttered, almost to himself. She blinked, confusion overtaking her fear. What? What do you mean?" He sighed, looking away. "There's never been a third floor in this building, Lori. We closed it down over a decade ago." David's job as a janitor at the abandoned high-rise office building wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough to cover his bills. The building had been mostly empty for years, left to decay after the company went bankrupt. Management wanted to keep it clean for potential buyers, though he doubted anyone would ever want the place. He was the only one there at night, tasked with tidying the dark, silent floors. Most of the floors were fine, but the 12th floor was a problem. It was colder than the rest of the building, no matter how many times the HVAC team checked the vents. Shadows seemed to flicker out of the corner of his eye, and there was a constant feeling of being watched. Still, it was work. David told himself that the drafts and noises were just part of being in a decaying building. Besides, he had never actually seen anything. Not really. And after 6 months, he'd learned to push the strange sensations to the back of his mind. But tonight, something felt wrong. As he took the elevator up to the 12th floor, he noticed that the usual hum of the machinery seemed off. It was quieter, somehow, and there was a smell, a faint odor of damp earth and something metallic. The elevator dinged, the doors sliding open to reveal the dark, empty hallway of the 12th floor. David stepped out, his footsteps echoing too loudly. His flashlight beam illuminated dust-covered desks and filing cabinets, all left to decay. A strange stillness hung over everything. He started cleaning, spraying the desks and wiping away the layers of dust. But as he moved, he heard the faintest sound of footsteps. He stopped, holding his breath, but the sound disappeared. David chuckled nervously to himself. "You're just jumpy," he muttered, but the silence felt heavier, like the building was listening. He moved to the end of the hallway, turning on the light in the conference room. It flickered before settling into a dim glow. As he cleaned the windows, he noticed something strange in the reflection. A figure, standing in the corner of the room. He spun around, but the room was empty. Shaking, he turned back to the window. In the reflection, the figure was still there, a man in a dark suit, his face obscured by shadows. David backed away, feeling his heart hammering in his chest. His skin crawled as he realized the figure was getting closer in the reflection. He bolted for the door, but when he stepped into the hallway, he was met with darkness. The light from his flashlight barely pierced it, and somehow he couldn't remember which way led to the elevator. Panic clawed at him. He took a step forward, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down. The footsteps started again, closer this time, echoing through the hall. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling, but he regretted it immediately. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was dead silence. Then, from somewhere down the hall, a voice answered, soft and hollow. "Come back." David felt the blood drain from his face. He broke into a run, trying to find the elevator. His flashlight flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. The air grew colder as he stumbled down the dark hallway, hearing whispers that seemed to slither through the air. "Why did you leave?" He ignored the voice, sprinting forward, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He turned a corner and saw it, the red glow of the elevator button at the end of the hall. Relief flooded him, and he ran faster, slamming his fist against the button. The elevator doors creaked open, and he stumbled inside, jabbing the ground floor button. The doors closed slowly, agonizingly slowly. Just as they were about to shut, he saw something in the hallway, a pair of eyes, glinting in the dark, watching him. The elevator finally began its descent, and David sagged against the wall, catching his breath. The cold, damp smell grew stronger, and he could feel a pressure building in his ears. The elevator stopped on the 8th floor, and the doors creaked open. The hallway was pitch black, and the air felt wrong. Thick, almost suffocating. He frantically pressed the ground floor button, willing the doors to close, but the elevator refused to move. And then he heard it, the sound of footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. A shadow appeared at the end of the hall, growing closer, one step at a time. David's flashlight flickered as he gripped it tightly, aiming it at the figure. His stomach twisted as he saw it clearly. A man in a dark suit, his face blurred, shifting, as if it were struggling to hold a shape. "Why did you leave?" the figure asked, the voice low and hollow like it was coming from a great distance. David tried to press himself into the back of the elevator, his mind racing. I don't know you," he stammered. The figure stepped closer, his face a mass of darkness, his eyes empty, endless pits. "You don't remember? But I do." David's flashlight flickered and died. In the darkness, he could feel the figure standing just inches from him, the cold radiating off it like ice. "You left us here alone," the voice whispered, the words thick with accusation. David could barely breathe, just terror locking him in place. Suddenly, the elevator lurched, the lights flickering back on. The figure was gone, and the elevator doors closed, jolting back into motion. David was alone, but he could still feel it, the cold, the damp smell, the heavy weight pressing down on him. The elevator finally reached the ground floor, and the doors slid open. David stumbled out, gasping for air, his legs weak and trembling. He ran outside, not stopping until he was several blocks away. He never went back to that building, but every so often when he was alone, he'd catch a glimpse in a mirror, a shadowy figure in the corner, eyes watching, waiting, and late at night he'd hear it just before drifting off to sleep. "You left us here." Kaylee had been warned about the long shifts when she signed up for the night clerk position at the gas station on the edge of town, but she needed the money, and she figured it wouldn't be that bad. After all, it was just a quiet, small-town gas station, mostly deserted in the dead hours. Most nights were uneventful, just her, the flickering fluorescent lights, and the occasional traveler looking to fuel up. But one night, during a rare lull around 3 a.m., something strange happened. Kaylee was sitting behind the counter, scrolling through her phone when she noticed movement outside. A man was standing by pump 3, staring at the store. She hadn't heard a car pull up, and no one was supposed to be out there. But there he was, unmoving, his gaze locked on her through the large glass windows. She shifted uncomfortably, trying to ignore the prickling sensation on the back of her neck. He was wearing a dark coat, and his face was obscured by a shadow cast from his hood. Kaylee waited, expecting him to approach the door, but he just stood there, watching her. After a few minutes, she worked up the courage to go to the door and open it slightly. "Hello? Do you need help?" she called out. The man didn't respond. He didn't even move. She could just make out his face under the hood, pale and expressionless, almost mannequin-like in its stillness. His eyes seemed glazed over, as though he were looking right through her. A shiver ran down her spine, and she closed the door, locking it. She walked back to the counter, keeping one eye on the man outside. But when she looked again, he was gone. She let out a shaky breath, relieved, but couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that lingered. She checked the monitors and waited for the end of her shift, trying to push the incident out of her mind. About half an hour later, as she was restocking the shelves, she heard the bell above the door chime. Kaylee looked up, expecting to see a late-night customer, but there was no one there. She walked to the door, peering outside, but the lot was empty. Just as she was about to turn away, she saw him again, the man in the dark coat standing by pump 3. This time he was closer, almost right up against the window. His eyes were fixed on her, wide and unblinking, his mouth slightly open in a slack expression that seemed almost wrong. A heavy dread settled in her stomach. She picked up the phone, intending to call the police, but when she looked up, he was gone again. She clutched the phone tightly, dialing the local non-emergency number. The dispatcher assured her that an officer would come by to check things out, and she waited, heart pounding, glancing at the door every few seconds. Within minutes, the officer arrived. He was a burly, no-nonsense type, the kind of man who'd seen his share of strange happenings in a small town. She explained what had happened, and he promised to take a look around. He walked out to the pumps, shining his flashlight into the darkness, but found no sign of the man. After checking the entire area, he returned, giving her a reassuring nod. "Probably just some drifter trying to spook you," he said, though there was a slight unease in his eyes. "Lock the doors and call us if you see him again." She thanked him, feeling slightly better, and watched as he drove away. She double-checked the lock on the door and went back to her post behind the counter, trying to shake off the uneasiness. Another hour passed in silence, and she began to relax, convincing herself it was just a random encounter. But at 4:15 a.m., she heard it again, the bell above the door, chiming as if someone had walked in. This time, the sound was different, sharper, echoing through the empty store. Kaylee's heart pounded as she turned slowly, expecting to see someone standing behind her. But the store was empty. She took a shaky breath and glanced out the window, half expecting to see the man by pump 3. But this time, he wasn't outside. She heard a noise behind her, like a faint whisper. Kaylee's heart raced as she turned back to the counter where the monitor for the security cameras flickered. The cameras glitched, and for a moment, she saw nothing but static. When they stabilized, her blood ran cold. The man was standing inside the store in one of the aisles, staring directly at the camera. Kaylee froze, her mind racing. She knew she hadn't heard the door open. She'd been watching it the whole time. But somehow, he was there, standing perfectly still, his eyes fixed on her through the monitor. Her hands shook as she picked up the phone, dialing the police again. "He's inside the store," she whispered, her voice barely steady. "Please, you have to send someone. He's inside." The dispatcher promised to send an officer right away, but before she could hang up, she heard footsteps echoing through the store. Slow, deliberate footsteps, getting closer. Kaylee ducked behind the counter, clutching the phone to her chest, her heart racing. The footsteps stopped and she held her breath, trying not to make a sound. Silence. She waited, straining her ears, but heard nothing. Slowly, she raised her head, peeking over the counter. The man was standing right on the other side of the counter, his face inches from hers, his eyes wide and empty. His mouth opened slowly, stretching wider and wider, a black, yawning void that seemed to swallow the light around him. Before she could scream, the bell above the door chimed again, and the man was gone. She blinked, gasping for air, her heart pounding. She looked around, but the store was empty, just as it had been before. The monitors showed nothing unusual. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. A few minutes later, the police arrived, but they found no trace of the man. They reviewed the security footage, but there was nothing. No man by pump 3, no figure in the aisles. As far as the cameras were concerned, she'd been alone in the store the whole time. Kaylee quit her job the next morning, convinced she'd narrowly escaped something beyond her understanding. But even after she moved away, she could never shake the feeling that he was still watching her, waiting just outside her line of sight, with that hollow, empty gaze, and his mouth stretched wide, wide open.